No one expected a standoff like this, a seemingly routine trade dispute between the United States and Canada that has spiraled into something far more monumental. For decades, these two nations were considered close allies, with deeply woven economic ties, especially in the automotive sector. Then, almost overnight, the atmosphere changed. Tariffs were announced, retaliations followed, and the entire North American auto industry found itself on precarious ground. Factories began calculating mounting costs, and political leaders scrambled to address the fallout. But the real story goes much deeper than headlines about steel or aluminum fees. Underneath the surface lies a complex web of alliances, strategic resources, and surprising maneuvers that could reshape the future of global trade. So how did we get here, and why is the auto industry at the heart of this conflict? In the next few minutes, you'll discover the startling events that triggered an economic domino effect. You'll also learn about how massive players like Tesla are caught in the crosshairs, and why Canada's untested secret weapon could overturn everything we know about trade in North America. Along the way, we'll explore political firestorms on both sides of the border, global aftershocks shaking Europe and Asia, and the real impact on everyday people, folks who just want to afford a decent car or keep their jobs intact. As you follow along, you might find yourself wondering, is there any quick fix, or have we crossed a point of no return? Could this dispute signal the end of one economic era and the beginning of another? Let's delve into the untold layers of this US-Canada trade war and see if we can uncover where it's all headed next. At first glance, it seemed like just another policy shift. The United States announced a sudden tariff on key Canadian goods, citing national security concerns and a desire to protect American industries. Critics questioned the rationale. After all, Canada had long been one of the most stable trade partners for the US. But behind closed doors, there were rumors of mounting frustrations in Washington. Some claimed certain American politicians believed Canada was outmaneuvering them in automotive manufacturing deals. Others whispered about ongoing disagreements tied to environmental standards or local labor regulations. Whatever the reason, this tariff wasn't just for show. It was big enough to jolt industries on both sides of the border. Within days, Canadian officials responded with sharp rebuttals and quickly drew up their own retaliatory measures. Suddenly, products that Americans relied on, from agricultural items to high-tech components, were slapped with new fees. What made this so surprising was the precision of Canada's counterattack. It wasn't broad or unfocused. It homed in on areas that would directly affect certain influential American constituencies. Instead of playing defense, Canada proved it was ready to punch back with unexpected force. This is where the media narrative began shifting. Initially, many had assumed the US would simply impose tariffs, Canada would express disapproval, and eventually both sides would negotiate a slight compromise. Instead, the tension soared overnight. Political commentators described it as the largest rift in US-Canada relations in recent memory, igniting debates about sovereignty and the potential collapse of once stable economic ties. Little did anyone realize how critical the auto industry was about to become in this escalating crisis. But that was just the beginning. To understand why these tariffs cut so deeply, you first have to appreciate the intricate cross-border ballet that is the North American auto sector. A single car often has parts sourced in Canada, shipped to the US for initial assembly, then returned to Canada for further finishing, and eventually sent back across the border for final touches. It's a seamless dance, refined over decades, ensuring both countries benefit from specialized labor and resource advantages. This strategy works brilliantly until trade barriers emerge. When the US imposed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, it struck directly at the raw materials essential to car production. Suddenly, factories saw their supply costs skyrocket. Automobile manufacturers, once reliant on fluid cross-border trade, scrambled to find alternate suppliers or pass costs onto consumers. Meanwhile, smaller auto parts makers faced existential threats. Without a cushion for these extra fees, many businesses risked layoffs or outright closure. Industry insiders began warning of catastrophic disruptions. Rumors circulated that certain US plants might have to halt operations if supply chains remained strangled. Car prices and dealership lots began inching upward, prompting questions among consumers. Was this just a temporary hiccup or the start of a long, painful transition? News outlets ran stories about factory managers speeding up production schedules, worried they'd soon run out of affordable metal. Canadian auto towns, historically reliant on cross-border commerce, braced for the worst. Their prosperity, built on the free flow of goods, now seemed under siege from an unprecedented policy shift. Once the broader public grasped the potential fallout, lost jobs, expensive cars, reduced manufacturing capacity, outcry grew. Ironically, the very tariffs designed to protect American workers threatened to undercut them if Canada continued its countermeasures. The Great Auto Meltdown looked set to impact everyday lives, overshadowing any initial intentions policymakers may have had. Still, a more surprising twist was on the horizon: the rise of electric vehicles and one company's unexpected entanglement in the conflict. And it was about to get even more dramatic. Electric vehicles represent the future of the automotive world, or so we've all been told. Companies like Tesla have transformed the industry, sparking a race for better batteries, greener technology, and new lines of sleek electric models. Yet few people realize how dependent Tesla and other EV makers are on Canadian resources. Nickel, lithium, aluminum, these are the building blocks of modern electric cars, and Canada happens to possess substantial reserves of each. As tensions escalated, whispers began about Canada using these resources as leverage. If Tesla struggled to secure raw materials affordably, production could stall, forcing delays in new model releases and spiking costs across the EV sector. The possibility wasn't just a rumor to scare shareholders. Experts pointed out that even a minor hiccup in the flow of these materials could throw off entire manufacturing schedules. Beyond Tesla, other electric vehicle makers also rely on specialized mining operations in Canada, many of which are critical for high-capacity batteries. Before long, stock analysts began sending up red flags, noting that if Canada imposed higher tariffs or export restrictions on these resources, it wouldn't just be a thorn in Tesla's side, it could reshape the global EV market. Countries like China, which produce large volumes of EV batteries, might seize the moment to outpace North American competitors. Meanwhile, U.S. policymakers faced growing pressure from environmental advocates who saw EVs as essential to meeting climate goals. Would Washington let trade disputes sabotage its own green initiatives? Of course, these escalations remained largely hypothetical, but the fear was real, and it rippled through boardrooms in both nations. To date, Canada hasn't fully pulled that trigger, but the threat alone has complicated negotiations behind closed doors. If Tesla's supply chain gets choked off, it could prompt them to reconsider their manufacturing footprint, potentially looking outside North America for more secure resource streams. That scenario would be a massive blow to U.S. ambitions of maintaining EV leadership. Yet there was another secret weapon Canada held in reserve, one even more potent than nickel or aluminum: energy. And that looming ace in the hole could rewrite the conflict yet again. For all the talk about steel, aluminum, and auto parts, there's another area where Canada quietly holds significant influence: energy. The United States relies heavily on Canadian oil, natural gas, and electricity. Thousands of miles of pipelines and power lines crisscross the border, fueling American homes, factories, and yes, cars. In normal times, this arrangement is mutually beneficial, with Canada profiting from vast natural resources while the U.S. enjoys a stable supply. Yet, in an escalating trade war, this reliability can flip into vulnerability. Imagine the ripple effects if Canada decided to restrict oil shipments or raise electricity export prices. Almost overnight, gas prices in certain regions could skyrocket. Industries would see soaring energy bills, and the average consumer would feel it at the pump or in monthly utility statements. Beyond mere inconvenience, such a disruption could grind American manufacturing to a crawl, especially in areas heavily reliant on Canadian energy grids. So far, Canada has signaled it's reluctant to weaponize its energy exports, possibly because doing so would generate its own economic reverberations. But the mere hint that it could happen sends shivers through U.S. policymakers. Nobody wants to watch a major American city go dark because of an avoidable dispute. Energy, far from just another commodity, powers the heart of each nation's economy, And if Canada shuts that valve, the ramifications would dwarf most other retaliations. For the moment, this remains a last resort, one that could either force the US to the negotiating table swiftly or lead to an unparalleled escalation. In the meantime, behind-the-scenes negotiations continue, as each side calculates how much it can leverage without triggering mutual destruction. Some analysts speculate that the energy card might never be played. Others say it's only a matter of time. Either way, both Washington and Ottawa are keenly aware that controlling the flow of energy is akin to controlling the lifeblood of industry. Indeed, it's a political tool no policymaker can ignore, and it ties directly into the fires now raging in each nation's government chambers. But energy alone isn't the only arena fueling political strife. Trade wars don't exist in a vacuum. They become political flashpoints that can shape elections, topple governments, or galvanize unexpected unity. In the United States, initial support for tariffs was strong among certain voter bases that believed such measures would protect domestic jobs. As the dispute drags on, however, factories are warning of layoffs instead of expansions, and farmers, facing retaliatory tariffs on exports, are feeling the pinch. This has triggered a wave of discontent in states that rely on trade partnerships with Canada, where local businesses are losing crucial markets and struggling to handle increased costs. Some politicians who once championed the tariffs have begun toning down their rhetoric, worried about backlash in the next election cycle. On the Canadian side, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has skillfully framed the conflict as a national solidarity issue. By positioning retaliatory measures as a stand for Canadian sovereignty, Trudeau has rallied a strong base of support, even among those who might not typically back his policies. According to rumors circling Ottawa's political circles, Trudeau's team has multiple contingency plans in case tensions escalate, hoping to preserve Canada's image as a formidable yet stable trading partner. But not everyone in Canada is unified. Critics argue that pushing back too hard could alienate smaller American companies that have historically partnered well with Canadian businesses. They fear a long-term fracturing of relationships that might not mend easily, even after a truce. Meanwhile, on the U.S. side, politicians in swing states realize the precarious situation they're in. Do they maintain support for protectionist tariffs or pivot to a more diplomatic approach in fear of public disapproval? The net effect is a charged political atmosphere in which every statement, every tweet, and every rumor can sway public sentiment. Trade policy, which once seemed like a distant topic, is now front and center in town halls and news broadcasts. And as these clashes intensify on the political stage, the rest of the world is watching closely, because the fallout isn't confined to North America alone. In fact, the entire global economy is feeling aftershocks. What began as a bilateral tussle between the US and Canada has sent shockwaves through global markets. European nations, wary of instability in North America, are hedging their bets by diversifying suppliers and trying to secure new trade deals. China, seeing an opportunity to step in where the US might be retreating, has increased outreach to Canada, hoping to fill any gaps in agricultural or mineral exports. For instance, if American tariffs scare away some of Canada's agricultural producers, Chinese markets could become an appealing alternative. Simultaneously, China's aggressive courting of Canadian rare earth elements and raw materials for electronics and EVs offers fresh competition to the US. Developing nations are also looking for ways to benefit from the rift. Countries in Latin America and Southeast Asia see an opening. If US-Canada tensions remain high, automakers or parts suppliers might relocate to regions with more stable trade relationships. These emerging markets hope to lure foreign investors by promising fewer trade barriers and lower labor costs. It's not just about short-term gains either. Some experts predict a long-term realignment of global manufacturing hubs if North American supply chains stay fractured. All of this underscores the most pressing risk for the United States: the deterioration of its global credibility as a reliable trade partner. Trust, once lost, isn't easily regained. If the rest of the world believes America is prone to sudden tariffs or unpredictable policy shifts, they may look elsewhere for stable, long-term alliances. Meanwhile, Canada's reputation as a stable and resource-rich country has, until now, helped it maintain strong global ties. However, if Canada too becomes mired in ongoing confrontations, some partners might start viewing it as a high-risk environment. Amid these shifting alliances, trade deals that took years to negotiate could be rendered obsolete. Everyone is asking, will this conflict be contained before it permanently alters the balance of economic power? Or is North America on a path that will rewrite the rules of international commerce for years to come? While policy experts debate these high-level questions, everyday folks face the most immediate challenges. Strip away the politics and corporate maneuvering, and you find real people caught in the crosshairs. Families who rely on auto manufacturing jobs worry they might be laid off if production lines shut down. Car buyers notice sticker prices creeping higher, wondering if they should delay that purchase in hopes things settle. Small businesses, particularly those operating along the border, struggle with unpredictable costs for raw materials. Farmers in both countries, long dependent on cross-border sales, are left watching their produce set unsold or face steep tariffs abroad. In some communities, the stress is palpable. Local newspapers run stories of laid-off workers uncertain about how they'll pay their mortgage. Mom-and-pop shops see expenses climbing, forcing them to pass on the burden to customers or close up entirely. Meanwhile, shipping delays become routine as companies scramble to adapt to new regulations and customs procedures. Truck drivers, once zipping back and forth across the border, face more bureaucratic red tape and extended wait times at checkpoints. Beyond the immediate financial toll, there's a growing sense of disillusionment. Many Americans and Canadians have always viewed each other as friendly neighbors. Now, the media spotlight fixates on tit-for-tat tariffs and provocative political statements, fueling a narrative of animosity. The psychological impact shouldn't be underestimated. Trade wars can erode cultural goodwill in addition to economic well-being. And if tensions persist, younger generations might grow up seeing each other less as partners and more as competitors, deepening the divide. Despite these hardships, there are glimmers of resilience. Communities have begun organizing support systems, job fairs, small business coalitions, and local partnerships to navigate these unsettling changes. Nonprofit groups push for cross-border dialogues, hoping grassroots movements might accomplish what politicians have failed to do. Still, such efforts might only act as temporary bandages if the larger conflict remains unresolved. So where does all this leave us? New developments keep surfacing, but the biggest question might be what's lurking just around the corner. Almost daily, new rumors swirl about behind-the-scenes negotiations. Some suggest the U.S. might lift specific tariffs if Canada makes certain concessions, such as adjusting environmental policies or granting American companies better access to Canadian markets. Others speculate that Canada is quietly brokering new deals in Asia and Europe, potentially sidelining U.S. trade altogether. If that happens, reversing course could be extremely difficult, even if both nations eventually realize the benefits of collaboration. Meanwhile, in financial circles, analysts buzz about the possibility of a black swan event, some unforeseen crisis or external shock that propels the dispute from a slow-burning conflict into a full-blown economic emergency. Could a natural disaster, political scandal, or global recession force both nations to get serious about resolving their differences? Or would it intensify the blame game, causing each side to dig in deeper? One especially intriguing rumor suggests that if the U.S. continues to ramp up pressure, Canada might formalize alliances with countries like China in unprecedented ways, potentially opening the door for more Chinese investments in Canadian resources and infrastructure. That would mean a significant strategic pivot, one that could send ripples through decades of North American cooperation. On the other hand, some in Washington believe that with enough internal political pressure, particularly from auto-producing states, the U.S. will have no choice but to soften its stance, leading to last-minute renegotiations and a grudging resolution. The truth is, we're at a crossroads. Either these tensions subside through diplomatic compromise, or they become the catalyst for a new economic reality, one where old assumptions about the friendliest border in the world no longer apply. Whichever direction it takes, it's clear the stakes couldn't be higher. In a world where trade once seemed predictable, the shockwaves of the US-Canada conflict have forced everyone to rethink what comes next. The auto industry, crucial to North America's prosperity, now stands on shaky ground, with supply chains tangled in tariff after tariff. Tesla and the electric vehicle movement find themselves in unexpected jeopardy, reliant on delicate resource streams that could be restricted or taxed at any moment. Political tensions run hot, with leaders battling public opinion and each other, while ordinary families bear the brunt of rising costs and job uncertainty. Beyond the continent, global players wait eagerly, ready to seize any opportunity left vacant by discord among old allies. So, are we witnessing a dramatic, once-in-a-generation shift in how two neighboring nations coexist economically? Or is this merely a temporary rough patch that will eventually smooth out once cooler heads prevail? No one knows for sure, Munyund, but what's beyond doubt is that these events will leave a lasting imprint on industries, politics, and the personal lives of millions. Old trade routes may be rerouted, allegiances could be reshaped, and a new equilibrium might emerge from the wreckage of the old. For now, the biggest question remains: how far will each side go, and at what cost? Share your thoughts below on whether you see a resolution or a deeper rift forming. After all, the fate of the North American auto sector and the wider global economy may depend on decisions being made right now, behind closed doors in Washington and Ottawa. Stay tuned for more updates, and remember, in this era of shifting alliances, nothing is off the table. If you found this exploration valuable, consider passing it along or subscribing for the next deep dive. Thanks for reading, and until next time, keep your eyes on the road ahead, because it might take some unexpected turns.